June 29, 2016, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues, Mike McKean and Ernest Perry. On our program this week, a groundbreaking moment, or more like 25 hours worth of moments, for congressional Democrats as they live streamed their sit-in using social media apps. It remains to be seen whether it'll move the gun control debate forward, but it's changing how many view access to the people's floor. We'll talk about it. The Brexit vote, an unexpected result that left many newsrooms scrambling in the early hours on Friday. How did the pollsters get it wrong? And could this be a preview of what's to come here in November? And going undercover in a for-profit prison. We'll talk about the Mother Jones investigation into the conditions for inmates and employees alike. There's a lot more, hopefully, that we'll get to as well before our time's up today, but we're going to start with Corey Lewandowski's new job as CNN's newest political pundit. The gig carries a $500,000 paycheck, and it's not exactly something that everyone's on board with. We're talking about Donald Trump's former campaign manager, fired last week by the Trump family for reasons that aren't entirely clear, but this is the guy who was charged with manhandling a Breitbart reporter, with banning major mainstream media outlets from campaign events, and now he's on CNN on a daily basis, providing an insider's view on Donald Trump and his campaign strategy. There have been several at CNN who are somewhat dubious that he'll be able to do a good job. Trump is notorious for having his employees and former employees sign ironclad non-disclosure agreements. So how honest will he be in his analysis? How much can he really say? That very question was put to him in his first CNN appearance.
During the term of your service and at all times thereafter, you hereby promise and agree not to demean or disparage publicly the company Mr. Trump, any Trump company, any family member, or any family member company. Did you sign something like that said no disparaging?
Let me tell you who I am, and for those who don't know me, I'm a guy who calls balls and strikes. I'm going to tell it like it is, because that's how I've had my entire career. And most of the time, it's been at my own detriment. People who know me know I'm a very straightforward person. I'll tell you exactly like it is, whether you like it or not. And, maybe that's the reason I don't have some of the jobs I should have had or been given some of those opportunities, because I'm a straightforward person. That's not going to change. No matter what I've done or what I've said, if something is wrong, I'm going to tell people it's wrong. If something's right, I'm going to tell people it's right. So there's nothing that's going to stop me from telling the truth, in my opinion, regardless of what that is. And I think that's what the people expect, and that's what the people deserve.
Right. The bottom line that the viewers want to know is, even when it's saying something bad about Donald Trump.
Look, I'm going to say it like it is. If I agree, if I disagree, I'm going to come out and tell you this is right, this is wrong, this is my opinion on things. And I think that's what the people have a right to have.
So what we didn't hear there, Ernest, and as soon as you didn't hear those words, yes or no, you kind of gave me a look like, what is he? No, he didn't say anything.
He said absolutely nothing. He is not going to violate the non-disclosure agreement that he signed with Donald Trump, because he knows that his former boss will litigate. And Donald Trump has been known to do that over and over again.
I have to say, though, I think that issue is kind of a red herring. I mean, no, he's not going to say anything against Donald Trump. That's not what he's being paid for, as much as CNN maybe would like him to go off the reservation a little bit. But just as Donna Brazile never gets off the Hillary Ranch, or Paul Begala, neither is Lewandowski going to get off the ranch. But that's okay. That's not what he's being paid for. He's being paid to do the talking points, but do them in an entertaining way. And I don't know if he's going to be entertaining or not, but that's why he was hired.
And I think you're exactly right about that, Mike. I mean, this is all about entertainment. This is the reason why Donna Brazile was hired, Begala was hired, why Lewandowski is hired. If someone from Cruz's campaign that was hired by MSNBC, they were hired to provide the sort of entertainment surrounding the whole campaign coverage, because they have to fill airtime. And the campaign, there's not much going on now. Not much is going to be going on until the conventions. So these people are there to provide this kind of information.
So there's been a lot of criticism that in hiring Lewandowski, that CNN is in some ways disrespecting or ignoring the contempt that he's very visibly had for the media and toward the media in the last few weeks. How much of this hire do you think was kind of like a land grab? This guy's on the market, we're going to get him before anybody else can.
Well, I mean, I think that was true, and that CNN was willing to pay him something. Now, they deny it's $500,000, but they were willing to pay him a good chunk of change to get him on the air, regardless of whether or not it was an insult to journalists. And a lot of journalists are insulted by it. I don't know that there was this overwhelming sense at CNN that they were going to start some campaign or petition drive. They haven't done it yet, but there were some people upset by it, and they should be. He has, as you mentioned, I mean, he basically assaulted a female reporter. He's banned the Washington Post and a CNN reporter at one point from covering the campaign. Those are things that journalists don't like, because if you don't have access to the candidate, you can't do as good a job of reporting on that candidate.
And you know, I'm not surprised about the grumbling. I mean, you would almost expect it. What I want to see is whether or not the fact that CNN has him now, what is he going to say? Is he going to say something that is probably going to upset Donald Trump to the point where his campaign, Trump's campaign, begins to go after CNN again in the ways in which Lewandowski was doing when he was working for Donald Trump? That's what I'm going to be interested in seeing.
Okay, well, so here in the U.S., we're about 6 hours behind the United Kingdom. So when the results came down in the wee hours of Friday morning that the Brits voted to leave the European Union, many newsrooms were left scrambling. Sure, we knew the vote was likely to be close, but the polling indicated it was more likely to go the other way and that the Remain faction would win out. But we've talked a lot recently in the past few months about the inaccuracies of political polling as of late, with the declining number of landlines, with people being willing to participate in these polls, and a bunch of other things too along those same lines.
Yeah, I mean, the case is that it's harder to do a public opinion poll well. And even if you can do a public opinion poll well, it's going to have a margin of error, some tolerance. And some of the polls in Great Britain got closer than others, but nobody predicted that the Brexit side was going to win. And, you know, I went to bed that evening, late that evening, having seen the story saying, well, some private market polls were suggesting that it was going to be that the Remain folks were going to win. So I was surprised, but I think maybe that's a reflection of how some of us who are in more privileged positions were reflecting on the reasons why Brits were or were not going to vote to stay in the European Union. And I think maybe that's on us, not some reflection necessarily of all the, quote, xenophobia and nationalism and all these negative reasons we attributed for the Leave faction winning.
But I think that's part of the reason why it's becoming difficult for the polling agencies to actually predict what's going to happen, is because when you start talking about issues surrounding nationalism and xenophobia, people are less likely to tell you what they're really going to do, how they really feel. And that skews the polling more so than anything else. I think it's the issues that are causing this.
So bring that back home for a minute here. How do you think that might have an impact or play out potentially similarly here between now and November with our next election?
I mean, I think it could. I mean, there are people already predicting that the Hillary Clinton Donald Trump election is going to be a lot closer than what others think. The question becomes, how is the coverage going to influence that? And there was a lot of coverage of Brexit, and the Remain people were really pushing toward the end and talking about the doom and gloom that would happen if Great Britain exited from the EU. And they were hoping that that was going to push them over the edge. I think some saw this coming, and that was the reason why they were really pushing the campaign. And now that it is actually materialized, there is this whole doom and gloom situation going on now, where you have the Europeans basically saying, no, we don't want 2 years, you can leave now.
So were some of those educational efforts, perhaps on the part of the press, too little too late?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think it's more of the larger question of elites versus a segment of the population that is resentful of elites. And that's certainly mirrored here in the U.S. It might not be for the exact same reasons, but I think we're seeing it.
But I think the immigration issue is similar. I mean, with us, here in the United States, it's more anti-Muslim, anti-Mexican, whereas there was anti-Eastern European and in Syria and that sort of thing.
I don't disagree with any of those things. I would just caution people to not draw too simple a conclusion about all of this. I mean, I don't think that 52% of the voting public in Great Britain are xenophobes or ultra-nationalists. Some of them are. I don't think that 40% or whatever that say they're going to vote for Donald Trump this year, all 40-some% of them are xenophobes or who are racists or whatever. Some of them are. There is this resentment on the part of people who feel like they have less or that they haven't been treated fairly by the economy and by elites, and that's real. And journalists are perceived as being part of that elite, and if we don't do something to address that in our coverage, I think we're going to lose.
I think you're absolutely right.
Okay. Well, last Wednesday, right around the time that we sat down to tape our program, there was some unprecedented activity taking place in Washington on the House floor. Representative John Lewis led the Democratic caucus in a call for a vote on 2 gun safety measures. At the same time, the Republicans were looking to call a recess and head home through the July 4th holiday. And thus began the No Bill, No Break sit-in, a 25-hour marathon protest by Democrats looking to elevate the discussion. Per House rules, when the session went into its recess, the floor cameras and mics were cut and the feeds all went dark. That is until a couple of congressmen picked up their cell phones and started live streaming via Periscope and the Facebook Live apps and kept it going for more than 24 hours.
What would be the reason that the Republican majority in the House is saying, well, we can't remove you physically, or maybe they will, but we're not going to turn on the microphone? As a courtesy, in this great democracy, for voices to be heard, turn on
So we've talked a lot as well in the past about the need for transparency on the people's floor, specifically here with the state legislature here in Missouri. But now we saw this on the federal level, too, in the shutting off of those cameras.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems that now that we have C-SPAN, and C-SPAN has tried to work with both parties to open up the cameras and the microphones and have that in the hands of let's say private, but not private in terms of C-SPAN. And the legislators, both parties, including Nancy Pelosi, who we just heard from, have sort of balked at that when they were in power. And now all of a sudden the Democrats are saying, well, hey, we need to open this up and we need to have the mics and the cameras on at all times.
Do you think they believed in that? Or do you think it was a situational thing where as soon as the mics and the cameras were cut on them suddenly, since you say Pelosi had stood in the way of it in the past, that as soon as the mics and the cameras were cut on them, they suddenly feel the need to have those cameras back?
Oh, I think so. But what they're finding out is that there are other ways to get to get their message out. I mean, you had Periscope, you had Facebook, and I think the Republicans were caught completely off guard when that happened. And now there may be a window of opportunity for C-SPAN to go in and sit down with all of them and say, hey, wait a minute, look at how this is playing out. You can't just control everything. This is the people's house. This is the people's, you do work for the people.
That sounds good, and I wish that were true, but I'm very, very skeptical. I mean, first of all, I think the Republicans were caught off guard in one way. They were caught off guard in thinking that House Democrats would hold a sit-in in the floor of the House. They have rules. They have rules that say you can't do any live streaming from your cell phones when the House is in session. The House wasn't in session. The cameras were turned off. I think a lot of people don't know until we talked about it either that the House Speaker controls C-SPAN's access. Not the House as a whole, not the leadership. The House Speaker decides what will be shown. And Nancy Pelosi was happy to wield that power when she was the Speaker. The next Democratic Speaker is going to do the same thing. Does that mean this wasn't a good thing for us to get a look at what's inside? Sure, it was. I just wouldn't think we better count on seeing that happen on a regular basis.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how effective the sit-in was. I mean, the issue was definitely an issue that needed to be addressed. And it has not been addressed. It wasn't really addressed in the Senate. They were trying to get it addressed in the House. That didn't happen. People are talking about this, the candidates themselves, not just the presidential candidates, but candidates for all the races across the country are talking about this gun issue.
The congressional candidates on both sides, the Democrats are able to go home now for the 4th of July break and go have town halls and talk to constituents and play up that they were able to do this. The Republicans able to turn this around and say, look what they did.
I've got to say, too, that this may have been on this one particular story, depending on your point of view about what the public feels about gun control, was maybe a good thing. But think about the longer-term consequences if the House of Representatives were to allow this, or the Senate. You think that the partisan gridlock that we have now would get better if members were pulling out their phones and live streaming every time something didn't go their way, if there were more protests on the floor of the House of Representatives. Some level of decorum is necessary for government bodies to actually make decisions.
I mean, I agree with you. I think that this is just going to solidify that sort of gridlock that's going on. I almost would like to go to what they have in the British Parliament, where you have the Prime Minister's comments on question time, and
which I do watch on
C-SPAN
sometimes.
I mean, I would love to see that. I think that would probably open this up a little bit more. You bring in the president, you bring in various people, and you have these kinds of discussions where people can actually see the business happening, as opposed to what we see now, which is virtually nothing.
Well, so let me ask you this. We talk, too, about how politicians sometimes have found ways, we've talked about this with Pete Souza and White House Photographs, how they're circumventing the press. You think that's what's going on here, too? They just found themselves a new way to go ahead and work around us, too?
Well, in this instance, I think they were pretty confident that many members of the press were going to be right on board with that. In fact, C-SPAN itself, not having access to the cameras because the House Speaker turned them off, they used this live streaming video as part of their coverage. So,
and I was dealing with some jet lag, so I was up all night. So I was watching it, frankly, and it felt kind of like that line from the movie The Truman Show, where you kept watching it because you wanted to see how it was going to end.
Right. And I think that's what they were going. It's like, okay, where does this go from here? Are they going to turn the cameras back on? They're going to turn the mics back on, so maybe they can...
Well, and they did at about 3 o'clock in the morning when the Republicans came back in to call the House into session to
adjourn.
And the cameras were back on at that point. Meanwhile, while all of this was going on, a couple of local reporters wanted to show how easy it is to get their hands on assault rifles. Paul Heinz bought his AR-15 in a fast food parking lot from another private citizen. That's perfectly legal in his home state of Vermont. And in Philadelphia Daily News columnist Helen Urbina said she was able to buy hers in a gun shop in less than 7 minutes. Both of these journalists said that they had no intention of keeping the weapons, that they wanted to make a point by buying them, and writing about it.
This isn't new. I think you've seen news outlets do this after almost every mass shooting, just to see how easy it was to get the kind of weapon that was used in the shooting. I think what was telling about this was, number one, how quickly they were able to do it, and then number two, once they got the gun, the struggle that each one of these journalists had in trying to figure out, well, what do? I don't really want the gun. Do I try to sell it to someone else and it could possibly get into the wrong hands and be used for malicious or criminal intent? Or do I just hand it over to police, which ultimately is what they did? But I think that was the part of the story that doesn't get told in all these other purchases that are done by journalists.
I mean, I think it was an interesting story. It was a day of story. It was kind of low-hanging fruit, so to speak, because you know exactly what was going to happen in the state of Vermont. Anybody can buy a gun from any private citizen without any kind of background check. We knew that would happen. So from that standpoint, did it change anybody's minds who already had an opinion about it? I don't know. On the other hand, I think about, there are some issues where it just takes a long time, at least for public officials, to have the courage of their convictions or whatever. I mean, I think about gay rights. It took a long, long time for elected officials to mimic what public opinion was. And it took a long time for public opinion to catch up to what, most people think was the right thing to do today. And maybe with guns, that may happen, but I don't know.
And I think in this instance, it was the style of gun. It's the AR-15. I mean, you're talking about a military style weapon. And when people see that weapon and they hear that, how easy it is to get, they go like, wait a minute, but, that's different from hunting and weapons that are used to hunt, or weapons that are used for target practice and that sort of thing. Shotgun or that sort of thing. Right.
Well, many of us have spent some time in the last 10 days or so binging on season 4 of Orange is the New Black. I know I have, Mike, you have, and I promise everybody at home, no spoilers if you're not yet up to date on the program, but this next topic will be of great interest to you. Remember, at the end of season 3, we see that a private firm has come in and taken over the running of Litchfield Prison, where the show is set. This week, Mother Jones has given us a glimpse into life for the prisoners, the guards, and the administrators of a for-profit prison. Shane Bauer went undercover for 4 months at Wynn Correctional Center in Winfield, Louisiana. He takes us through the application process, through his month-long on-the-job training, and then onto the tier, where he spent 12-plus hours a day with the inmates, until it was time for him to come clean and resign.
What's up with Bauer? You ain't heard? I go, no.
I'm actually calling because I've decided to resign.
He's all over Facebook. He's an undercover reporter. I mean, that was so funny.
And I was like, oh my God, I work with this dude like I work side by side with him. I would have never thought.
Oh, Mr. Bauer, I hate to hear that. What's the reason for resignation?
Everybody was like, oh man, I knew it. He didn't fit in around here, you know.
Looked like, you were willing to hang in there and, hopefully promote.
You was pulling your notepad out every 5 minutes. I said, well, you ain't writing nobody up. Everybody had kind of like figured it out.
So in the future, if you decide to change your mind, then, you know the process,
Yep,
okay?
yep. All right, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Wow.
So I was thinking about this. The average time spent on site for the average news article is somewhere between 1 and 2 minutes. And I spent 2 hours reading this article beginning to end. It is downright fascinating.
It is, and it's what, 30-some thousand words
Yeah.
long.
I
plus
put it
there's
into
video
Microsoft
clips.
Word. It's 62 pages if you were to print it out on paper.
I mean, we talked about the previous story. As valuable as it might be to show how easy it is to get a gun, that was kind of a one-off, a very easy thing to do. This was not easy to do. This took courage. This took commitment. Frankly, on the part of the reporter, Shane Bauer, he went through some personal changes that were very interesting for him to document. I think you really should try to read the whole thing. I'm just amazed at how any news organization today would have the guts to do this. I mean, first of all, he had to get into the prison. And as it turns out,
Which was a whole lot easier to do than anybody would have imagined.
That's for sure. I mean, he applied with his real name, with his real social security number. He even put the name of the organization that owns Mother Jones magazine on his application. And there was no background check because they were going to hire anybody who could stand on 2 feet and breathe. They were going to hire them into that prison.
And that's part of the story, is the fact that these private prisons are hiring at a huge clip, mainly because they have a retention problem. The pay is low, the work is horrible, which the story outlines, and so they have an easy hiring process, and he actually took advantage of it. I suspect, even though you don't see this in the story, I suspect that he knew that was going to be the case, and he used it to his advantage,
or at least suspected. So, some, including CCA, the company for which he went to work, have questioned his ethics here in going undercover. But as we mentioned, he never once lied about who he was.
No,
and what was going on
he
there.
wasn't asked, and he said, if I had been asked, I would have been truthful. But no one ever asked me.
And frankly, I mean, just taking the big picture, not focusing on him himself, why would Mother Jones do it? Was it ethical? Well, what other way is there to tell a real story about what happens inside a for-profit prison? There's no way to get in. I mean, it's very difficult. These companies, they don't provide information. They're not as accountable as the state
They're not
prisons.
subject to freedom of information laws in the same way that state-run institutions are.
I will say, though, I mean, the one thing that you have to think about is this was really courageous on the part of the news organization, because since Food Lion, a case where basically ABC News was sued successfully by a grocery store chain because they had reporters go undercover to show that the store was basically having them repackage tainted meat. I mean, Food Lion won. ABC News, I mean, the amount of money they won was not very much, but they won. And so most news organizations since that time have really shied away from this kind of undercover reporting. And in this instance, it was the only way to tell that story.
Yeah, but I think the difference between this and Food Lion was that the undercover reporters in Food Lion lied on their applications.
Right.
He didn't do that in this case. He was very upfront about what he put in his application and was willing to say, hey, yes, I am doing this, if he had been asked. And I think that's maybe the one thing that gave Mother Jones a feeling of, hey, this is something
We can
that
stand behind
we
this.
can stand behind this.
There is one thing that wasn't harped upon in the article, something that's worth mentioning. Shane Bauer's previous experience as a prisoner, though not here in the United States. He and his now wife and another man were arrested and jailed for more than 2 years in Iran. The hikers that were released about 3-4 years ago.
Yeah, so I mean, I think he has he has that experience, but now he's as a prison guard. He's on the other side, so he's looking at this from a totally different perspective, but within the same kind of environment. And I think that you can see that as you go through the story, as you read through it. And I actually heard this piece. They did a piece on NPR over the weekend, and I found myself sitting in my car in the heat, listening to this because it's mesmerizing. A lot of it has to do with the fact that I covered CCA in its early days as a reporter when the for-profit prisons industry was just getting started.
There was one ethical issue that I think was legitimate, and that was the fact that the reason, in fact, that he finally quit, because one of his colleagues brought a drone at night to the prison to fly over and try to get some pictures or some video, and was arrested by the local sheriff.
Reality encroaching in, okay, maybe this is an Orange is the New Black spoiler, but again, a drone taking play in season 4 as well. Before we go, a ruling that Led Zeppelin's famous guitar riff in Stairway to Heaven wasn't ripped off another artist. An interesting verdict in this case.
Yes, I mean, I think this sort of goes back to, we've had a lot of these copyright issues come up involving music. This one plays out for Led Zeppelin in their favor, and I think it helps that the fact that they were able to establish that neither one of these groups, even though they knew each other, they had been on the same road together, but they really established that, hey, we didn't know what they were playing.
Although I have to say, and this is the polar opposite of the ruling recently in the case against Pharrell Williams and Robin Thicke for ripping off a Marvin Gaye song, in each instance, the legends won. Led Zeppelin won, Marvin Gaye's family won. And I think there were lots of things the judge did not allow into the case that may have made it harder for the jury to come back with a verdict. An
example of those, maybe?
Well, for example, they weren't allowed to bring in past allegations of plagiarism. In fact, Led Zeppelin had settled a couple of cases in the past, and that was one of the things. The other, they wouldn't allow them to play the actual final recorded music. They had musicians come in and play from the sheet music, since that's what the copyright case is all about.
Okay. Well, we are just about out of time for today's show. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. If you're a fan of podcasts, get your views of the news to go. We are available on iTunes, or you can find that wherever you find your favorite podcasts. We also invite you to follow us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ViewsOnKBIA, and these are all great ways to watch or to listen to our program again, to leave us comments, questions, see previews of what we'll be talking about next week, and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show, and to Kyle Felling for handling the audio for us. I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again next week when we're back with you for another edition of Views of the News.